a lot of the mantras about what life is about have to do with being the fittest and being, able to survive long enough to reproduce, and all sort of very minimalist to my ear understandings of what being alive entails. The word flourish, which happily seems to be being taken up by lots of us now, describes the fact that just getting along and everything may get you to reproduce and may get you a place in an ecosystem, but everything that's set up in modern organisms is much more than that. The idea is to have bounteous resources, have all sorts of homeostatic mechanisms and all sorts of ways of doing things that allow each individual creature to flourish, to make the very best of its potential. And I think that is, in fact, how to best describe life.
Welcome to the Journey of the Universe 10 Years Later podcast. My name is Sam King, and today I'm fortunate to be joined by renowned cell biologist Ursula Goodenough. Ursula Goodenough is a retired professor of biology at Washington University who now lives in the woods on Martha's Vineyard. Her lab research focused on cell biology and evolution, and she taught many courses on these subjects. Her influential book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, explores the religious potential of our science-based understandings of the natural world, and Ursula is about to release the new edition of this book later this year. She has 5 children and 9 grandchildren. Ursula, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure, Sam.
Could you first tell us what prompted you to write this new edition of Sacred Depths of Nature, and what's unique about and what has evolved in this book since your initial publication?
Okay, well, the first edition was 25 years ago, so new scientific understandings have emerged, and I incorporate those, and a few of the things that I said in the previous edition are no longer correct, but not very many. Most of it is just new stuff that we've come to understand. And what has also evolved is my own understanding of this orientation, since in the past 25 years, many other people of all walks of life and stripes and colors and everything have joined in to explore this trajectory. And I have been honored to share ideas and thoughts and feelings with these people, and that has greatly amplified and deepened my own understandings. So I'd say 2/3 of the book is probably new at this point, reflecting mostly my new appreciation of how this orientation works for people.
I know 10 years ago, you spoke with Mary Evelyn Tucker as part of the Journey of the Universe conversation series.
Yes.
And in that discussion and in the book, you talk about a form of primitive discernment among cells in this autogen, this original prokaryotic organism. And you suggest that these cellular organisms have a sense of purpose, aims, perhaps even a perception of well-being. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on this idea of the cell as a self.
Okay, well, so the first creature that I lift up in the new edition, I call it an autogen, and it's not really a cell, it's a self-perpetuating entity that was originally modeled by one of my scientific heroes, Terry Deacon at the University of California, who's also a person who talked with Mary Evelyn 10 years ago. So we're all a set. And in that understanding of just this very most stripped down version of a living being, the autogen, I point out, following the lead of Terry, that this entity and all subsequent entities that evolved from such an entity can be thought of as a self, in that they have the capacity for self-maintenance, for self-reproduction, for self-protection and self-organization. And that as life evolved, these same self properties have always been there, have always been something that allows us to distinguish biological life. And they have evolved in obviously fantastic ways for billions of years, but have never lost this sort of drumbeat of who they are and what they're about.
You hint at this idea of flourishing, that living organisms tend toward flourishing and well-being. And I'm wondering if that is the basis of a kind of ethic that you provide in your sense of eco-morality, if this flourishing of all living beings informs the environmental ethic that your religious naturalism is prompting us to envision.
Well, sure. I mean, so, a lot of the mantras about what life is about have to do with being the fittest and being, able to survive long enough to reproduce, and all sort of very minimalist to my ear understandings of what being alive entails. And the word flourish, which happily seems to be being taken up by lots of us now, describes the fact that just getting along and everything may get you to reproduce and may get you a place in an ecosystem, but that everything that's set up in modern organisms is much more than that. The idea is to have bounteous resources, have all sorts of homeostatic mechanisms and all sorts of ways of doing things that allow each individual creature to flourish, to make the very best of its potential. And I think that is, in fact, how to best describe life.
Can you elaborate a little bit more for those listening who may not have a background in biology about what we know about that movement from lava to life, or from the lithosphere to the biosphere, perhaps through hydrothermal vents in the ocean deep? What are biologists telling us most recently about what may have happened to engender the first emergence of cellular life on this planet?
Well, we don't really know. So everything that we have come up with is hypothesis, but the hypotheses are increasingly attuned to an increasing understanding of the history of the Earth. So the Earth came into being about 3.8 billion years ago. And during the first billion years, which is a really long time, the whole planet was just, awash in all sorts of volcanic and roiling and churning and getting its act together, if you will, for life to find a place within it. But this whole origins of the Earth, which I like to think of as the planetary matrix, preceded life and was the incubator for life and provided the habitats for life to take off. And so I think of biological organisms as being a manifestation of the planetary matrix, one thing that characterizes it, and a feature of it that we, of course, find particularly interesting since we're part of it. But it all is dependent on and grateful for the wonderful matrix that came into being. And once things settled down on the Earth, and these various habitats started to form, particularly the habitat of the oceans, which is clearly where life began, something took off. And, that's the part where we're all coming up with models and ideas, but they all of the models and all of the thinking includes the concept that there were building blocks for life, little small molecules like carbon dioxide and oxygen and urea that came together in conditions where chemistry could occur to make larger sugar kinds of carbon-based molecules. And this is called the primal soup. And that once there was a primal soup, at least in some places, a favorite place for locating all of this is near these hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the sea, where chemistry was presumably and still is actively taking place, that some self-organizing critter got going and then evolved to the current life forms.
Throughout the book, you talk about this idea of emergence, or something else from nothing but, this creativity emerging from the self-organizing dynamics of matter. And you even mentioned at one point Michael Calton suggesting that transcendence can also be horizontal, an immersion within the natural world as a participating critter. And I'm curious to hear how you understand this idea of transcendence, for one, which you mentioned in the context of traditional religions, but without affirming the idea of transcending to some kind of supernatural realm. Like, how do you understand emergence as a kind of transcendence within the planetary matrix?
So emergence can refer to non-events that happen in non-life as well as in biological life. So the emergence of buoyancy happens when water forms ice crystals, because there's space in between the lattice of the H2O molecules that allows it to float on top of water. So something else from nothing but can happen even without life. And what I try to lift up is that during the origins and then the evolution of life, that this something else from nothing but kept on happening and kept on being retained as organisms became more and more complex. But it's the same kind of dynamic that we could think of in the whole matrix. And then, well, there are two ways of articulating the notion of emergence. One is that emergence gets you a new shape. So the new shape of water when it's frozen, or the new shape of a molecule when it forms during chemistry. And so these, I'm calling emergent properties. They're not fixed, they're moving about, but they're different from the second kind of emergence that we're talking about, and that's called emergent dynamics. So dynamics refers to something that's happening over time, that one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. And while these patterned events are happening, something else's new kinds of processes arise. And so their emergence can be thought of in both a if you will, static context and a moving context. And both of these are very essential to how life works. And we didn't get to Calton, but
That's okay. That's okay.
Do you want to move to that, or do you want to stay with the
anything you'd like to say about Calton?
So most of the traditional religions have, although named differently, versions of two kinds of human experiences, one of which, using Christian language, is called imminence, and one that's called transcendence. So imminence is the coming in of something from the outside, usually referred to as something supernatural or of the spirit, or out there, that comes into a person and fills them with spiritual experience. And the other is called transcendence, where the human in turn moves out into these non-natural frameworks and experiences something that's in addition to, more than, whatever the natural world. And so I try to think about those two concepts in terms of a religious naturalist orientation. Transcendence, I speak of as just the incredibly rich and deep experiences that we feel when we encounter the natural world writ large in all of its magnificence, without the need to feel that this is something otherworldly. And transcendence is usually configured vertically, that you're going up, you're going out, you're going away from. And Michael Calton has this wonderful essay where he says that transcendence can also be horizontal. There's no reason why it has to be otherworldly, that it can be right here, right now, this. And so I riff on that idea for a while.
It's really an interesting idea, and especially thinking about the way in eukaryotic organisms, cells sort of maybe transcend themselves in some ways to orient themselves to the larger whole, right? Cells take on a sort of a more cooperative dimension in sort of eukaryotic organisms. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you understand that process, that emergence from like single cellular organisms to multicellular organisms, and how that maybe reflects some idea of this horizontal transcendence.
Okay, well, most of life is single-celled. The multicellular ones are the ones we're most familiar with, but there are more bacteria in your gut than there are of you, okay? And single-celled organisms have in their various ecosystems all sorts of ways of relating to one another as predator, prey, symbiont, parasite. I mean, you don't have to be multicellular to have relationships with other beings. So that once the other beings showed up, they were part of the planetary matrix and part of what all creatures have been interacting with, creatures of their own kind and of different kinds. Once you get to multicellularity, it's just kind of the same thing, only more complicated. And the multicellular beings that we're most familiar with, of course, are animals with brains, and therefore what what I define as consciousness is the particular kind of awareness that animals with brains are able to pull together. And in this case, it's just very much more complicated, but still basically the same kind of thing as all of life is doing. Figuring out what's going on, paying attention, being aware of it, not paying attention to what's not interesting, and fitting in to their environmental and ecological context.
You invoke this idea of consciousness in the book and try to provide sort of a biological grounding for what that might mean. Curious to hear a little bit more about how you understand consciousness at the cellular level. Is that an appropriate word? I know in philosophy, some scholars talk about panpsychism, this idea that matter itself is imbued with consciousness. Is that something that you could ascribe to?
So that doesn't work for me. I certainly honor those who think that way, but when you write a book, well, there are two ways to write a book. One is to sort of put down what everybody thinks, and another is to let the reader know where you come out. And adopted that stance. And so for me, I've made the distinction between awareness and consciousness, both words having all sorts of meanings in the literature and in history. And I speak of awareness as a property of all living creatures, all biological organisms, and reserve the term consciousness to the particular kind of awareness that animals pull off, because brains have these neurons that are able to interconnect with each other and pull together something that is distinctive. I'm not saying it's better, but it's one that is the basis of the way that we humans think, and humans are the ones reading the book. And so talking about consciousness in that sense is made sense to me and makes sense to me.
I know we've discussed before this idea of animism, which you bring up in the book, you know, and you invoke some indigenous ways of knowing about ascribing a sense of personhood to the more than human world, plants, animals, even rocks and mountains, for instance. And I'm curious from your perspective, how you understand the idea of animacy in the natural world, and what, if you draw boundaries between, you know, what is aware and perhaps what is not aware, and then maybe what environmental ethic emerges from that way of envisioning the natural world.
Okay, so I certainly have no problem with animism as long as it's talking about biological beings, because you know, all biological beings are aware and communicating and paying attention and all of that other thing. Where I part company with animism is part of what I understand to be inherent in lots of animistic traditions, which is, as you say, the concept that rocks, mountains, rivers, clouds, etc., also are living. And what I've been told is that these understandings entail another way of knowing. And it turns out that this other way of knowing is not accessible to me. It doesn't happen. And so I do not, therefore, in any way dismiss those who have these understandings. But for me, it was important to find another way to express my sense of what is the planetary matrix writ large, most of which is not a biological life form. And what I try to express in the book is my spiritual connection with the rest of the planetary matrix as being immersed in its geological essence, that rocks and rivers and mountains are magnificent because of their mountainness, their riverness, that I offer my respect and reverence to, and think about them in that context as sharing the planet with those that are biological creatures, fully deepening my soul in their presence.
I really admire the way you're able to come to that sense of reverence for what you consider non-living entities or parts of the planetary matrix.
So living is, of course, you know, this very, it's this very tricky word, and we humans, I'm not saying that this is the case for those who are deeply embedded in animistic ways of thinking, but those of us who aren't, nonetheless animate everything all the time. We talk about our car, you know, she doesn't want to start. Okay, I mean, you know, we just do that. And we talk about a river as being joyous to be free of her pollutants. Okay, I mean, so there's that kind of language is built into the way we think and express ourselves. And in that sense, rivers are alive because they're moving and functioning and doing things. But I still prefer to honor the river for what it is.
Yeah, I'm really struck by your respect for alterity, or that which is different than human, and sort of trying to create an environmental ethic that respects rocks and rivers and mountains in their rockness, their riverness, their mountainness. And your book is rife with really rich metaphors that try to animate the scientific understandings and help readers who don't necessarily have a background in biology to understand the dynamics that you're trying to illumine. And you speak about how scientists all the time use metaphors to explain scientific ideas. How do you go about using metaphor to illuminate your science without overly anthropomorphizing the natural world, or sort of projecting human conventions on that which is more than human or different than human?
I go ahead and explain to my readers early in the book that I'm going to be doing this, that I'm going to say that molecules choose to do something and so on, because that's the way we think. And to not do it, to have everything be in the passive tense, would make for, I think, a much less interesting read. But once you say that that's what you're doing, then I hope the message is clear. I hope that none of my readers are imagining that the molecules really have a preference in a way that we think of having a preference, i.e. consciously or as aware beings, but rather that given their shape and their properties and their electric charge and everything, it is preferable for them to be in one part of the cell than another. And I could say it is preferable, or I could say the molecules prefer, and I go ahead and say the molecules prefer.
I want to move to a few other qualities of this emergence that you explain over the course of this cosmic story, this 13.8 billion year sequence of cosmic evolution. And in the context of biological evolution, you mentioned the emergence of nurturance and empathy. And I know in the Journey of the Universe project, the Emmy award-winning film, for instance, explains the emergence of compassion tracing back to fish in the early ocean and the advent of maternal care. And I'm curious to hear how you envision these early roots of qualities such as compassion or empathy, given that some, like Herbert Spencer interpreting Darwin, really exalt this idea of survival of the fittest, or emphasize the sort of competitive, self-seeking aspects of the natural world. Where do you see the origins of empathy, compassion in this biological story?
Well, I think I start with nurture. I certainly start with nurture in my thinking. And I see nurture, which is giving care to that which is not yourself, but to another critter, as being launched with the origin of eukaryotic sex. So if there are examples of nurture in the bacterial or the archaeal world, I'm not familiar with them, but I'm certainly all eukaryotic creatures, including the abundant single-celled ones, when they undergo sex and form a new organism from the fusion of two cells to make a single one, they, in all critters that we know of, they turn on genes that in this new organism protect it. In some cases, they put big shells around them or cell walls that protect them from the environment, because sex is usually triggered in these creatures by a change in the environment that is in some way not optimal. And so they're trying to use sex as a vehicle to create new kinds of critters who might better deal with these new circumstances. But there's always some sort of coat put around these guys that is often very elaborate, and the provenance of expression of many genes to make these sort of spores or fertilized eggs be able to persist. And when you get to the multicellular critters, the same thing. Fish have all sorts of ways to put their fertilized eggs into various containers and protective environments so that they are able to survive and flourish. Once you have birds and animals, you start to see versions of parental care and what's important about this is that when birds and animals mate and form the next generation, they create an embryo that then develops into an adult. And these embryos in their early stages, their larval stages or their newborn stages, are typically nurtured by one or both parents in behavioral ways, not just setting up coats and stuff, but actively fed or protected in some way that we're all very familiar with. Where compassion comes in, a lot of people have been studying evidence for empathic reactions in animals, and they're found abundantly in animals that organize themselves into social groups, where that's part of the deal, is that you, if you're a member of a social group, you care about other adults in the social group and are troubled or upset or otherwise triggered when they are suffering, and you understand that suffering because you yourself have an understanding of your own suffering. And the response is then, if possible, to do something that will alleviate that suffering. But these kinds of responses have been found in the laboratory to also apply to at least mammals who don't usually form social groups, like rats, who, if there's a conspecific that's being disabled in some way, they are also upset and want that to stop. And if they're given the opportunity to have the manipulation stop, they do so. Evidence for compassion and empathy has been seen in mammals and birds who live in social groups, and also even in animals that don't normally live in social groups, like rats. And then I said, to my knowledge, there's no evidence for that kind of behavior in snails, but that may be because we don't really understand how to pick up on what snails are feeling. And so I certainly can't rule that out.
It's so fascinating to hear about these sort of seeds of nurturance or care, even maybe preceding birds and mammals, but many different examples.
Well, nurturance goes all the way back.
Really remarkable. And then you later mentioned this anecdote of a young bonobo fatally injuring a bird while playing with it. And the bonobo picks up the comatose body, carries it to the top of a tree, and then actually like actually tried to help this creature fly, which I found to be a remarkable sense of almost remorse and empathy for this bird within our sort of primate cousins. So really, really fascinating insights. And I'm wondering, does that for you provide a basis for environmental ethics or morality generally grounded in the biological community? Or do you see the eco-morality you're trying to help evoke as something more uniquely human, something that's more constructed as part of our symbolic consciousness?
Well, no, I mean, I think that what we do is put concepts into language and have names for them. Okay, so we have a name and we talk about eco-justice, eco-morality, all sorts of names for what you're describing. And other critters experience, other animals, let's say, with conscious minds, certainly experience their relationships with other beings, and sometimes these experiences are predatory, like a cat killing a mouse. Sometimes they are cats snuggling with one another in friendship and mutual admiration. So I think that it's, for me, the whole notion of being conscious of one's surroundings is inherent to all of life. And we're the ones that are giving a name to it. But it describes how every ecosystem works.
Your sort of framework of religious naturalism, you draw some connections to the traditions of East Asia, perhaps Confucianism and Taoism. And I'm struck by this parable by this early Confucian thinker Mengzi, who talks about the child in the well, how a person walking by a child who's fallen into a well would be moved by compassion to help that child. And that is what Mengzi sees as a innate sprout of compassion within the human. And I'm curious to hear maybe a little bit more on the humanistic side, the connection between the scientific insights and these cultural religious traditions that you invoke, how you see them as complementary in some ways, particularly among these East Asian traditions who don't necessarily posit a supernatural deity, and how that it has influenced your thinking.
Oh, it's influenced my thinking enormously, as have the indigenous traditions, who also have this same kind of sensibility. I mean, we could say that the monk walking past the well and noticing the child is really no different from the bonobo picking up that injured bird and trying to get it to fly. I mean, it's the same instinct of being outside of oneself and into the lives and the feelings of the rest of nature. It's not like these understandings are not, for example, in the Abrahamic traditions, certainly Jesus talks about them all the time, parables galore on being sensitive and responsive to the needs of others. That's kind of, in my mind, what he's about. So the big difference then, looking just along these lines, is that the Abrahamic traditions have this monotheistic organizer of everything, whereas the Asian and indigenous ones have localized those sensibilities more within the natural world. But I see the compassion as being a piece of all religious traditions. It's part of, it's the point in a way.
Yeah.
Loyal Rue has a whole book he calls it religion is not about God. And what his argument is, going through many different historical traditions, is that what these traditions are really trying to do, as he puts it, is educate the social emotions. So, as I also try to develop in the book, we come from a social lineage. We have social emotions that you could say are baked in, but these, in humans, these come about in the context of our cultural and religious traditions that organize our moral sensibilities. And so they are developed in those contexts using language. And so it sounds different, but to my mind, it's all coming from the same source.
It's really powerful. And that deep sense of reverence that you emphasize throughout the book also manifests to these religious traditions. I mean, you're invoking scripture from, the Abrahamic traditions and, different perspectives from indigenous traditions, East Asian traditions, and you recognize the power, the ethical visions of these religious traditions. And I know that you've been connected with the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology and some of their work, and and you recognize the power of religious traditions to help drive ecological change and restoring the Earth community. And I'm curious how you see the power of religious naturalism as adding to this conversation, as helping to provide answers and moral visions to address climate change, species extinction, toxic pollution. What can religious naturalism offer us on a global scale?
Sure. Well, I mean, the traditions that have come to us historically are based on understandings of how things are, cosmology, a mythos that was generated given the understandings of nature that were available to the persons who were writing those texts and telling those stories and organizing those ceremonies and rituals. And so they are speaking in a different voice from the story that we now have, that I love to call everybody's story, that has been come to us via scientific inquiry. And so everybody's story is telling in some ways, new version. I mean, Confucianism doesn't have a lot to say about DNA, okay? So the fact that we can now talk about DNA and ask ourselves, what is the religious potential of the new understandings that have come to us, doesn't mean that we're going to therefore arrive at really different places from where the traditions have come to. It just means that we get there in a different way. And what I try to emphasize throughout the book is that these eco-moral understandings that are already inherent in the historical traditions are terrific, and they fully map onto what it is that we understand in everybody's story. We just use different language. We have different ways of thinking about it. And the reason that, to my mind, developing the religious naturalist orientation is that I see it as particularly suited to global conversations, that we at this point desperately need a planetary ethic that transcends individual cultures, nations, religions, and so on, and has to do with how we take care of the place, okay? And we have to take care of the place globally, individual work in individual ecosystems is crucial, but a large understanding is vital for things like the health of the oceans and climate change and all of the global concerns that that we are also very embedded in. And so I see a religious naturalist orientation as working in two contexts. Some people are just turned off by, for whatever reason, the traditions, maybe because they had a bad experience with them growing up, or for whatever reason, it just doesn't work for them. And such persons have, of course, been with us throughout the ages. The traditions have always been criticized by outliers, but they've always been considered outliers, while the cultural trajectory continues along the same lines. And I see this orientation as also being one that, what I found it with experience, really resonates with people who have, for whatever reason, either not entered or have left a traditional orientation, but still are seeking ways to orient their lives religiously.
It's beautifully said, Ursula, and I'm really struck by your commitment to some of these maybe perennial truths that you see within religious traditions that are perhaps emerging in new forms, such as religious naturalism, and your commitment to even that word religious, or the sacred depths of nature. And I know some might want to move beyond religion altogether, or language of the sacred, of spirituality. And what for you is the resonance of affirming religious naturalism as compared to more humanistic naturalism, and a sense of this sacred in animating this worldview, and in the activism emerging from this sensibility?
So this term humanist is very interesting, right? So when you say humanistic and contrast it with religious, this speaks to a trajectory in particularly in Western thinking, where the term humanist has been used to contrast with religious. And for me, first of all, to me, it's just a terrible term. It doesn't resonate at all, because it suggests that the human is the point. And for me, the human is not the point at all. It's the natural world of which we are a part. So to say, I could never, I can't imagine having the words come out of my mouth that I am a humanist. It just, but it's more than, so if we substitute for humanist, let's call it substitute secular, okay? So secular versus religious, at least. There are probably millions, billions, I don't know, of people that we could call vanilla naturalists, okay? People who take the scientific understanding seriously, orient their lives in this context and everything, and yet never, I shouldn't say never, yet resist or have not yet taken the opportunity to explore the religious potential of those understandings. And those people are fine. They're all over the place, and they're doing great work, and there's many of them are on the front lines in environmental justice. So being a naturalist and moving in the directions that a religious naturalist goes is that's probably always going to be the case. A person who is comfortable calling themselves a religious naturalist, as the t-shirt slogan that we've come up with is that a religious naturalist not only takes nature to mind, but also takes nature to heart. And this taking nature to heart if we ever have a t-shirt, we might even put that on the t-shirt, has to do with the many, I'll call it spiritual responses that are engendered when one immerses oneself in the natural world, takes in its story, and takes in one's place in it. We, from the very beginning, when we started, so the term religious naturalism has been around for a long time in various guises, and various people have written it, used it often with a theistic sort of background to what they're talking about. And the so when those of us who are now sort of in the lead on promoting this idea first did it, we realized that there were a lot of people that were going to be turned off by it. Again, the people that I lifted up earlier who have had bad experiences with religions, or don't believe in religions. And so we refer to it as using the R word. There's actually, I would say, a very important difference between a religion and being religious. A religion historically has entailed a large understanding adopted by a culture that has a set of capital B beliefs and capital and rituals and ceremonies that support those beliefs, and usually has some sort of a clergy, either the elders in the village or the monks or whoever. They often have buildings and have financial contributions. So religions, we can have a book about the religions of the world and name specific things. Being religious, I would say, is a frame of mind, and a religious person may or may not resonate with and hook up with and join a particular religion. So, but still, we're slicing and dicing here, and these distinctions, if we're successful in making them, are ones that we sort of have to make one soul at a time. Because many say religious, don't want to go there.
I'm really struck by these components of eco-morality that you really bring forth as part of religious naturalism, this emphasis on compassion and fair-mindedness and reverence and courage. And it's remarkable to see how you're integrating your profound biological insights with those deep affective commitments to our need to attune ourselves to the natural world and to come up with an ecological ethic that can drive the global changes needed to address the great challenges of our time. And I'm curious, as we wrap up here, if you have any parting ideas for viewers or suggestions on how we can carry forward the kind of environmental sensibility that you're invoking. And for viewers who may come from a religious vantage point or a secular vantage point, or anywhere in between, what sort of message would you want us to take forward from your work?
Well, I just wrote a book about it. I've tried my best to lift up where this can take my reader. And I'm joined in the writing of this book and in all sorts of other ways with a group that we call the Religious Naturalist Association, which can be found online, where we have hundreds of members from 50 states and 30 countries at this point, of people who have found this concept to resonate with them, and just sign up to sort of say, yeah, me too. There's nothing that we do or anything, we just are. And how this plays out in the future, I have no idea. We just all are doing our best to help people access it, make it available, and we'll see what happens going forward.
Okay, well, Ursula, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your career of remarkable work and the way you're continuing, even in your retirement years, to inspire and animate and be part of these changes that we want to see in the world. So thank you so much, Ursula.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's been great to talk to you and get to know you.
You as well.